When a mass shooting occurs, we look to the shooter's past in search of signs indicating intent or clues as to why the shooting occurred. We do this not only to process and understand a tragic event, but also to look for opportunities that we missed to prevent that shooting so that maybe we can prevent the next one. What has become clear from looking at some of these mass shooters is that some of them have histories of committing intimate partner violence. And that raises the question, can we prevent some mass shootings through firearm restrictions for intimate partner violence offenders? For a domestic violence or intimate partner violence offender to be legally prohibited and actually prevented from accessing a gun, 4 steps need to be successfully completed. The first step is that law enforcement needs to know about the violence, or a domestic violence restraining order must be petitioned for. Those are the 2 ways domestic violence offenders get firearm restrictions, through criminal convictions or current domestic violence restraining orders. The second step in this process is that the case needs to proceed through the justice system to a conviction or to the granting of a domestic violence restraining order. If those don't happen, no firearm restriction. The third step is that the case must qualify under federal or state law for firearm restrictions. And those qualifications vary from state to state. And fourthly, the firearm restrictions need to be implemented and enforced so that someone is actually prevented from purchase and possession of a gun. Now, the fact that some of these shooters are known to have domestic violence histories suggests that we did not successfully complete those 4 steps for those shooters. Between January 1st, 2014 and December 31st, 2017, there were 73 mass shootings for which we know the shooters' identities. And when I use the term mass shooting here, I'm referring to the shooting deaths of 4 or more individuals in one event. These shootings take place in public, they take place in private businesses, in the home, in houses of worship, anywhere. In 32% of those shootings, the mass shooter killed an intimate partner. And in 53% of those shootings, they killed an intimate partner and or other family member victims. In other words, in over half of these mass shootings, domestic violence of some sort was a factor. But how many of those shooters had known histories of intimate partner or domestic violence? In this research, we determined to the best of our ability whether these shooters, these known shooters, had criminal convictions, charges, or police reports for domestic violence, whether they had domestic violence restraining order petitions or orders, and whether there were mentions that they were suspected of domestic violence in the media. And we found that 38% of these 73 mass shooters had some mention of domestic violence, either through the criminal justice side, civil justice, or the media. And those with mentions of domestic violence were more likely to shoot intimate partners than those without mentions of domestic violence. But if we look at intimate partner and or family member victims, we still see that those without any mention of domestic violence, that 44% of those without mention of domestic violence killed intimate partners or family member victims. That's a very high percentage. Does this mean that none of those people had histories of domestic violence? Well, not necessarily. It's possible that they just didn't make it into the justice system in a way that we were able to detect, or the violence was kept secret, wasn't reported to the police, as is unfortunately often the case in cases of domestic violence. Now, 28 or 38% of mass shooters did have detectable histories of domestic violence. 61% of those were known to the justice system, either on the criminal side or the civil side through domestic violence restraining orders. And it's the domestic violence restraining orders that I want to talk about. So this is the process through which one starts with a petition for a domestic violence restraining order and ends with a legal firearm restriction. First, someone petitions for the domestic violence restraining order, or DVRO, and maybe an ex parte order is granted. And an ex parte order is that emergency or temporary order that is put in place very quickly before there can be a hearing that the respondent had an opportunity to attend. Now, sometimes the ex parte order isn't granted, so there will be no firearm restriction. If the ex parte order is granted, there might be a firearm restriction, and that largely depends on where you live. These gray boxes are exit points from the pathway to the firearm restriction. And under federal law just doesn't provide for firearm restrictions on ex parte orders. And in many states, they haven't provided for firearm restrictions on ex parte orders. So if you live in one of those states, there's not going to be a firearm restriction. Some states have legislated that firearm restrictions can go on ex parte orders, so you might be safeguarded if you're in one of those states. Another qualifier could be the relationship between the petitioner and the respondent. Dating partners are often left out. So if you've dated someone, never married them, never had a child together, never lived with them, they might not qualify for the firearm restriction. And again, this depends on where you live. Some states have legislated that dating partners can have firearm restrictions, some have not. And particularly for ex parte orders, they are left at the discretion of the judge as to whether or not that person's going to get a firearm restriction. And if the judge decides this case isn't going to get one, you're not going to get the firearm restriction. Now, regardless of whether you get a firearm restriction through this ex parte order, there'll be a hearing, a full hearing that the respondent had the opportunity to attend. Now, a judge at that point could still decide that there isn't going to be a domestic violence restraining order. But if there is, those restraining orders might qualify under federal law for the firearm restriction. Only those given after a full hearing qualify for the federal law, or for the federal restriction. But the relationship might still not be there. Again, you have to be married to, or been married to, have a child with, or live or used to live with your violent partner in order to qualify for the federal restriction. And many states are the same. So there is that opportunity for that person to slip through the cracks and not get the restriction. And even though federal law provides for this restriction in cases that qualify, in many states there's still a discretionary component. Maybe someone is a dating partner and there's discretion as to whether the judge has to can put the restriction on there, and the judge might choose not to. Now, some of these exit points are about practice. One of the mass shooters that we looked at had a petition for a domestic violence restraining order against him, and in the petition, his intimate partner explained that he had threatened her with guns, and the judge denied the domestic violence restraining order. Just denied it. And a few weeks later, he committed a mass shooting. He killed his entire family. Others are policy, holes that we can plug through the law. We can extend these firearm restrictions to ex parte orders, federally and in states. We can extend these firearm restrictions to dating partners, federally and in states. One of our mass shooters was a dating partner, so wouldn't have gotten the firearm restriction. But we can change that through law. We can make it mandatory for judges to put those firearm restrictions on these restraining orders. It's been mentioned a lot, and it's entirely true, that this is retrospective work. We are not good at predicting which of our domestic violence offenders are going to go on to commit mass shootings. So we might need to shore up these holes and let fewer domestic violence perpetrators fall through the cracks. Broader applications of these firearm restrictions may cover more potential mass shooters. But it's important to remember that even the ones who aren't potential mass shooters are domestic violence offenders. We can't lose sight of that. So even if we aren't preventing a mass shooting, we might be preventing future domestic violence and future domestic firearm violence, or the shooting deaths of only 3 family members, and I say that facetiously. So, thank you very much.